Hey, there's Courtney.
Hello. Okay, can you guys all hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right. Well, I understand there has been a little bit of a challenge in terms of figuring out next steps. So why don't we go ahead and get this discussion started, because this is a really interesting and critical element as we talk about how to combat extremism and terrorism, is this idea about aligning incentives in the online environment through advertising. And so we're going to have a really interesting discussion today about what companies who are involved in the advertising ecosystem can do to make sure that they're not monetizing terrorism and extremist content, to talk about the role that advertising plays in amplifying undesirable content, and efforts that are being taken to mitigate those impacts, as well as the economic incentives of platforms and advertisers aligning to prevent violent hate-based content, and also the extent to which these systems need to gain legitimacy, and how they can do that, so that we're all aligned and there's a level of trust involved. So before we get into the discussion, let me introduce myself. I'm Courtney Raj. I'm a fellow at UCLA Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy. I'm sorry I can't be there in person with you all today, but my work focuses on the role and impacts of technology policy on media organizations, and I've been involved with the countering violent extremism efforts for the past decade. I'm joined on stage in real life by John Montgomery, a specialist in brand safety and trust in the digital media industry, who heads up the global brand safety practice in Group M, which he established in 2017 after concerns were raised by clients over the quality in the digital supply chain. And he also helped establish the Global Alliance for Responsible Media. We're going to refer to that by its acronym GARM, and definitely talk about that in the discussion. We're also joined by Christopher Kenna, chairman and founder of the Brand Advance Group and the director of the UK Conscious Advertising Network, which is a network whose goal is to embed human rights within commercial and political decision-making in relation to advertising. And again, we really want to bring in the impacts on human rights and political rights into this discussion. So we'll be hearing from Christopher in a bit. And we're finally joined by Ross Frenette, founder and CEO of Moonshot, which is a company working to end online harms using evidence, ethics, and human rights, and using advertising to counter extremism. So first, as we, just to kick off the conversation so we can level set, make sure everyone understands what we're talking about, I want to go down the line and start with you, John, to understand what the problem is that you're trying to address. So we know that, lots of content out there is undesirable. So are advertisers funding terrorism? Talk to us about this challenge, and specifically about why advertisers care about this topic. How does GARM fit into this? This cross-industry initiative addressed at the monetization of harmful content via advertising, and explain to us how this all fits in, and then we'll go down the line and hear from the other panelists. John.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Courtney. There are a few things in there that maybe let's start off with, do advertisers fund terrorism, which is, I think, a great headline. And even in the worst of days, around 2017. When there were a number of ads on extremist content, we tried to add up all of the money that could possibly have gone to all of the extremist organizations, and we couldn't come up with much more than $100. So no, advertisers don't fund extremist content, even at the worst of times. But that's not the problem. The problem is that extremist content exists on the internet, and that's what frustrates advertisers. They don't want to be on that platform. So it's not that that's the issue. The issue is it exists, and we need to work with platforms to get it off there. Maybe I can take a step back and just say where this started. In 2017, this issue really emerged. It had been around. We've been trying to address it in our advertising in our advertising agency. But and this date is etched in my memory, February the 8th, 2017, the venerable London Times, some of you may remember this, ran a 5-page article naming and shaming more than 20 global, highly reputable brands for appearing on extremist content. And there were shots of them in the newspaper. And of course, this created a huge concern, the risk of reputational damage. And that's when the advertising business really swung into action and said, what are we going to do about this? And I think that was a good catalyst, because that then started us having to have a look at how technology can help, how operational procedures can help to create things like allow lists and block lists to keep our clients' advertising away from that. So we've now worked with third-party technology companies that can identify harmful content and keep that inappropriate content away from our brand advertisers. We've also worked with platforms to create their own technology on monetizing that content. One can't get advertising from Google unless you have 1,000 followers and 4,000 hours per annum. And they now have a new standard for Google Shorts, which is their TikTok competitor. And so the platforms have come forward with their own technology, and I think we've made huge strides in the advertising business to protect our clients from appearing adjacent to inappropriate content. The chances of an ad appearing in extremist content is now highly unlikely. So that's great. But as I said earlier on, that's not what advertisers are worried about now. They're worried about this cesspit of really awful hate speech, divisive content out there on the internet. They don't want to be part of that platform. They want to be part of a constructive. The internet, in its potential, is an absolutely amazing, wonderful thing. And so in 2019 at the Cannes Film Festival, we launched together with Unilever and Mars and Diageo something called the Global Alliance for Responsible Media. And it really is to address together the harmful content across the web, to create better standards, measurement, transparency. We can talk about it. I don't want to talk too long in the introduction. We can talk about the detail as we go through. And what was starting to happen in the brand safety space is there were ad agencies sniping at the platforms. There were clients sniping at the platforms. There were publishers and tech companies sniping at the platforms. But nobody was sitting around the same table collaborating on a solution. And so for the first time, what GARM became is a collaboration of all of the platforms, all of the publishers, all of the industry bodies, all of the ad agencies, all of the marketers together, now several hundred members working in working groups to address these issues. Has the problem gone away? No, it hasn't. But they've started addressing common standards, aggregated measurement reports. If you are so inclined, you can go onto the World Federation of Advertisers or the GARM website, and you can see an aggregated measurement report of a transparent report of each platform and how each platform has taken, how much harmful content there was, how long it took to take them down, what the incidence of that was, and you can look at it across all platforms and the progression across across time. So they've made huge strides in that space, but of course it continues. So let me stop there, and we can talk some more as we go forward.
Thank you, John. Really important. I think I wanted to definitely return to the idea of this kind of cross-industry collaboration and the different stakeholders involved. But before we do that, I'd like to turn first to Christopher and hear a little bit more about the Conscious Advertising Network, because on the one hand, you're, I think, also trying to use this idea of advertising being more conscious about the type of harmful content it might be associated with, but you're also thinking about issues with diversity and inclusion on those platforms. And I think one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot in this space is how do you ensure that efforts to, counter violent extremism online or address other types of harmful content doesn't end up, say, overly impacting content by, people who are Muslim or by minorities, Muslim minorities in India, or, whatever the issue is in the country or the context in which you work. And so I'm really interested to hear more about how your work intervenes on this topic. Thank you.
Yep. I am going to be that person on the panel, and fully respect, especially with GARM, all the work that John's been doing, but I'm going to disagree and say there is a number put against how much is spent by advertisers on content that is hate speech, that is, terrorism content, recruitment content, and it's about 2.6 billion. Now that was done by NewsGuard and the UN. And I'm sure you can all remember, YouTube had a boycott because advertisers found their content next to ISIS recruitment videos. It blew up in the press, and then, brand safety, sort of all the advertisers started pulling, and there's been boycotts against Facebook because of monetization of content. I could probably pull, if somebody gave me their mobile phone here now, I can find you 10 videos of black people getting beat up just on Facebook right now, and there's ads all over it. So I think we've got to sort of, I think we've got to own that to fix it, for me. And I'm not saying it's indirectly. Did Unilever, and now, like yourself, I work a lot with Louis DeComo and the people in Unilever. They do not want to fund any of this, because how can you stick a black box on your social media and say, I stand next to, black people, whether it's African American or black British, but then your ad comes up against any hate speech content from any platform, even well-known platforms like Fox News and stuff like that. So I'm just going to name and shame the whole day. I think we gotta own that, because that is advertisers funding it, and if we turned it off, our work, in Conscious Advertising Network, is just having 7 manifestos: hate speech, online harm, child protection, all of these. Sorry, big chat thing just come up in front of your face, totally put me off. Let me start again. Yeah, the 7 manifestos. Yeah, the 7 manifestos. So I think, and these manifestos we then give out to the whole industry to make sure that they all, take this seriously, understand what their advertising is doing. And it's not just where the ad shows on a social media platform. It's also, how are you depicting in your ads, whether it's a TV ad or in the media buying, how are you depicting certain communities? Are you using racial stereotyping in your ads? Are you engaging that community at all in the creative and then the media you put it in? Not all ad spends need to go to Murdoch's. They can go to black-owned publications and to LGBT and disability and stuff like that. So that's the work we do to make sure that happens.
Great. I mean, that's really interesting, because it seems like you're taking this very holistic approach, which is especially important when we're talking about things like countering extremism and terrorism, because we know that, they don't just start online. A lot of it is about representation and feelings of belonging or outcast, et cetera. So we're definitely going to return to some of that. And I'm always happy to hear disagreement on a panel, because I think, I don't want to focus this whole debate on whether or not terrorism content is monetized. We do know that advertising is showing up to it, whether that's monetized or not. My research shows that we are monetizing. RT, I believe, was reported to get $8 million for monetization on one of the platforms, and that's a propaganda outlet. So anyhow, let's move on. I want to hear from Ross before we kind of delve further into some of the issues that have been raised, because Moonshot is using advertising to counter extremism, essentially by purchasing space against the terms that commonly, according to Moonshot, lead to extremist content, and then trying to redirect. So use that space to redirect people to more positive content or psychosocial interventions. And you've been doing this a while. So tell us a little bit about how this works. And we'd love to hear an example or something about what you have seen the impact be?
Yeah, absolutely. Great to be here. So for us, as you said, we come at the advertising world from a counter-terrorism, counter-extremism perspective rather than an advertising perspective. But over the last 7 years, we've become intimately familiar with how this technology operates. The fundamental logic that underpins it is, we're all very familiar with the fact that if you Google a couch, you'll get followed by couch ads for the next 4 weeks on your phone. We're all familiar with this has happened. So what we decided to do in partnership with Google, I guess, say 7 years ago, is to try and use ad tech for good. So try and figure out how we can use these algorithms, use these systems that are so common in everyday life, so common in politics, to understand and counter extremism. So essentially what we do is, as Courtney said, is we purchase advertising space. It depends on the platform. So, on Google search, we will purchase ads against particular search terms. So if someone is looking for, ISIS bomb manual, it almost doesn't matter whether or not they find the bomb manual. The fact that somebody was looking for it in the first place is of concern. So straight away for us, that's someone that we should be thinking about. We should be targeting, but we've also done it in other ways, and this is where our we end up in these really interesting ethical quandaries. So we map. Back in the day, we'd map jihadi and Nasheed, which were all over YouTube. These days, we map incel videos, we map far-right videos all over YouTube, and a lot of the time, these things are monetized. There's advertising against them. The question then becomes for us is there's this. It's useful from a counter-extremism perspective because if someone is consuming this material, then they're right square in my target audience. If it's a recruitment video, if it's jihadi anashid, if it's a far-right video, then I want that advertising space. But we always have to make sure and do sense checks to make sure the channel hasn't been monetized, so the person uploading it isn't getting any revenue. And we have found instances where that was the case, and we've tried to kind of grapple with that ethically and think, is the risk that some of this will go to people uploading this stuff worth the risk that we would give them money? And we always end up on the side of not, which is where I do think that it's a bit of a cop-out. Go on, yeah.
You end up on the side of not what? Not
so if
or not
yeah, absolutely. We will not advertise against. So we will not purchase advertising on a YouTube channel where the YouTube channel itself is uploading extremist content and itself would be receiving revenue from us. So there are some middle cases there where you can advertise against particular videos or you can advertise against particular pieces of content, but the creator isn't getting a cut. And if the creator's not getting a cut, we're okay with advertising against it because it's just a way of reaching our audience. But the fact of the matter is, in either circumstance, the technology company's getting a cut. So I think the kind of, is tech funding terrorism directly? No, it's not. It's a bit of a red herring. I think, is tech making money from terrorism is maybe more what we should be focused on. And as someone who spends all day, every day trying to find ways to ID terrorist content that is monetized that we can then advertise against, I can say that it very often is. And we can get into reasons for that, but it certainly is. To give some, you asked about a particular example, and I could give examples all day, Courtney, so I'll just give one and then we can move on. Something that we've started to do, and we've done this recently in the United States, is move away from more traditional, inverted commas, counter-narrative material, so trying to talk people out of being extremists, and actually started targeting material at folks that are trying to access terrorist and extremist content that is psychosocial support. So texting, crisis intervention, suicide hotlines, things like that at these individuals. So they don't know that the reason they're being targeted is because they're trying to access, Breivik's manifesto. All they see is advertisements on their social and elsewhere asking them, do you feel lonely? Do you want to talk? And then at the end of that, there is an intervention service which is trained and able to actually talk to that person, engage with them, de-escalate them from violence. So, this year alone, we've had, I think it was 5 active interventions, so someone who's prevented from hurting themselves or someone else using this methodology. So advertising, when used well in a targeted way, can be used to find people who are thinking of carrying out violence and can be used to de-escalate them. So that this world we live in where we're all tracked all the time is at times creepy, but that technology can be harnessed for good and can actually do some real good in the world as well.
Can I jump in to ask quick one, just on what you said. Is that all right?
Well, I ask Courtney if it's all right. I don't know.
Well, I'm just thinking, I heard you say, you've invited me to go off, so I am a little bit, but if the channel that you didn't monetize because the money was going to them, does that get took down? Because otherwise then you just left.
Yeah, we'll report that stuff.
Okay.
Yeah. So whenever we're doing this tracking, we also have reporting mechanisms where we do the same thing. No, it's a good question, and it's where we end up somewhat undermining ourselves because we have these two tracks: is we want to make the world a better place, so we want this stuff taken down as quickly as possible, but we're also building campaigns off the back of the stuff that's still up. Yeah. So we have this two different teams, and one is almost racing against the other, if that makes sense. Yeah. So you need to constantly stay on top.
And Ross, just a quick response, like, do you have a transparency report where you report the type of content that you report, and are you a trusted flagger with the platforms?
I believe we're a trusted flagger with YouTube, and elsewhere we will often just go straight into their team. So we're lucky enough to have good relationships with the various different platforms. So we'll sometimes go straight into trusted folks within those. And in terms of transparency, we publish a human rights audit every year. So we have an external company that comes in, has full access to our documentation, full access to interviewing our staff, and we then publish that on our website every year. It doesn't give breakdowns like the ones you're suggesting, but actually I'll take that back to the team because it's definitely something to consider.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I mean, I think this is a really interesting, but all of these three initiatives that you all lead, or kind of more than that, since John, you play a couple different roles. They're all really interesting because they are essentially non-governmental efforts, largely in the kind of private sector, along with civil society, some a little bit more multi-stakeholder than others, to really leverage the incentives that are embedded in the digital ecosystem, the technology platforms, and the advertising system to realign those incentives. So we see a lot of efforts around the world to mandate, certain standards around online harm, which gets to who gets to decide on definitions and things like that. I guess I'd like to hear from, especially Christopher and John, about these standard-setting efforts and how you're thinking about harmonizing definitions, implementation requirements, transparency, and I particularly am interested in with respect to GARM, where you've created a whole framework and reporting structure, and the companies have gone along with it and done things that, I'm also involved in the Global Internet Forum for Counterterrorism, having a lot of the same discussions that seem much, much more difficult to get to reporting. And, there doesn't seem to be any conversation, but certainly terrorism and violent extremism is one big bucket of harmful content. So can you talk a little bit, and maybe first John and then Christopher, about how these standards are developed and how are they, say, legitimate? Do we need regulation? Should this just remain within the industry and civil society? Love your thoughts on that.
Okay. The interesting thing when we started this in GARM was chatting to the platforms and trying to get a definition of hate speech, a definition of misinformation, even a definition of extremist content. Twitter, Facebook, Google, Snap, each one of them has a completely, not completely different, but a significantly different definition of each. And so when we're mandating that our advertising doesn't go towards that, we can't have one definition for Twitter, one definition. So it took us probably the best part of 18 months to align all of the platforms with definitions across 12, or we started off with the evil 11 and now we've got the dirty dozen, very much like your manifesto. We've got what is pornography, what is child endangerment, what is misinformation, each of those individual things. And at least we have common definitions now where we can start addressing these. Does it mean that nothing will appear? of course not, but what we are able to do in these aggregated measurement reports is, at least when we're talking about misinformation, we talk about child endangerment, we're talking about the same kind of content. And so we're able to define it, we're able to measure it, and we're able to measure progress against it. So the whole standards and definition doesn't sound like a very interesting area, but it was a vitally important one for us to start addressing. And what was great about it is that not everybody came on board immediately. And so a lot of the organizations, you must remember that there were probably 20 organizations involved in measuring brand safety in some way. There's Double Verify, there's Moat, there's Integral Ad Science, but then there's Google and Facebook and Snap, and each of those individual ones had their own definitions. Now I would say probably 90 or 95% have got the same definitions across each of those areas. Which is a great beginning for us. And you know what, you can't mitigate what you can't measure, and so that's a really good beginning to do that. And if everybody can get on board and say, this is what constitutes hate speech, this is what constitutes child endangerment, at least we're able to start tackling that.
Which is, really fascinating because, you and I have now been doing these discussions for the past couple of years, but it's so interesting that in other fora like the GIF-CT or the SASB, ISB standard setting, we're still really trying to figure out definitions where you guys have already created them. So I think there's something to be thought about, how do we get outside of our own kind of thematic focal areas and into the broader discussion. But Christopher, I want to ask you, kind of the same issue around standard setting. How did you come up with these mandates? How do you see, for example, the efforts that John is doing in terms of legitimacy and effectiveness?
So we waited for John to do all the hard work, and then we used that as our baseline. That's pretty much what happened. So, thank you very much, John and the GAM team.
Great collaboration.
But seriously, thank you, because it could so easily have been, no, we want our own standards.
Yeah.
And some people started that way, but what was great about GAM is that the marketers got behind it, which is why we wanted to run by the World Federation of Advertisers, because they are the ones with the money. Yeah. So this is, you keep on talking about incentives here. Advertisers don't want to fund whatever the amount is. They really do not want to fund terrorism or any form of inappropriate, harmful content. And they are the ones with the money. The ad agencies and the technology companies and all of us we are on the periphery. They are the ones who say, I'm going to put X amount of money in Facebook, I'm going to put X amount of money on Fox News. And they are the ones we need to be that need to be influenced and in fact make the decision. And so that's what's really driven this. This is the momentum that's driven this. And I think that's why it's really great that you guys have adopted those standards.
Yeah. And so we use GARM as a baseline, as a definition. We use legality. A lot of these are based in law. Hate speech, there is laws around it, terrorism, etc. So law is a good baseline as well. What is breaking the law of the land? And then, I suppose for me, and I can only talk personally, was a strand of education as well, because, without educating yourself in the way I did that, apart from listening to great people like yourselves, is got myself on a few advisory boards to understand. So it's going to seem like I'm blowing smoke up my backside, but bear with me. I sort of sit on a few boards. The WFA, I sit on the advisory board for the WFA, sit on the Metropolitan Police, I sit on ITV, the V&A Museum, and TikTok. So they're the boards. I've got no time to actually run my own company. But the reason for that is, if law and order, being one strand, entertainment and understanding how that, and the advertising on entertainment, the past, understanding the past to see the future, which is the V&A, TikTok, social media, and then where all the money is, the WFA. For me personally, sitting on them, learning from the people on there, and then bringing that back into the conscious advertising network, it felt like they were the strands. I'm quite lucky. I'm black and I'm gay, so I pretty much get offered to go on most boards, to be honest. They're like, oh, there ain't many black gay CEOs in the UK. So I sort of had the pick, and it felt like if you're going to educate yourself on them pillars of the community, what society is. It sort of sits within a little bit within all of them, and that's what I personally bring back. And like I said, GARM did a lot of the legwork on definitions, because we still, sit down with government and with trade bodies like the AA and stuff like that, and ISBA and with the WFA, and still you sort of have to, it's nice to have that beacon where you can, when everybody's arguing, well, that's not what I think that the definition is, because the thing with definitions is you put a lot of your personal bias and thoughts into a definition. What might hurt me might not hurt you, and the same for the other two on the stage. So I think, you sort of need that beacon, that lighthouse, that baseline. But essentially, I think we shouldn't ever forget that it's the baseline is law. All of these things are breaking laws, and if that's your baseline, we're not going to allow anything that allows people to break the law. We're not going to fund anything that allows people to break the law.
But does it? I mean,
so,
I worry about the law in this perspective. And getting back to your original question about should this be legislated, there are so many bad things that happen on Fox News that don't break the law. Really, really bad things. And I'm just obviously putting my politics out there. I guess there are bad things that happen on MSNBC as well, which don't break the law, and that's what's dividing society. It's not just the law. That's why we've got to create these standards and guardrails, and I think create new guardrails. How they get created without destroying what we've got as the internet, without destroying free speech is a subject of another panel, I think. But we do have to create guardrails within the law. Of course, we can't break the law, but it's absolutely critical because these guys are running wild. They're telling lies all the time on the left and the right.
John, let me just jump in here, because I think that's exactly the point. Is a lot of this speech that is being regulated through these kind of private sector and non-governmental efforts is not necessarily illegal, particularly in the United States, where a lot of the tech platforms, the major social media platforms are based, isn't illegal, which is why I think it's a very interesting topic to think about how these essentially self-regulatory efforts are working, because at least in some places that raises less concern than governmental interventions, but it also can raise more concerns because of the legitimacy question. With that, I do want to ask Ross about Moonshot, because it is different. It's a private for-profit company, and you collaborate with tech platforms. I'd love to hear more about how you think about this and how you think about definitions and some of the issues that Christopher raised in terms of the outsized impact that a lot of this type of intervention can have on communities that have been historically marginalized or vilified, particularly in predominantly white, Western, Christian majority countries. How do you deal with that, as a for-profit company?
Yeah, and I think the free speech question is an important one. I think the targeting of minority groups is an important one, and this is where a lot of the conversation at this event has quite rightly been focused on takedowns. How do we take things down quicker? How do we take things down more effectively without, and Courtney, I know I was watching a panel you were on earlier as well where you spoke about this, but we've worked with activists, not Raqqas being slaughtered silently, but a different group inside Syria who had their material reported by ISIS, and then the anti-ISIS material was taken down by these platforms. So this issue of takedowns is not cost-free. Removing content disproportionately. You mentioned earlier our biases. We pour our biases into algorithms. So many of these takedown efforts, well-meaning though they may be, essential though they may be, have negative knock-on effects that we need to recognize as a group, and we need to recognize they're disproportionately going to target ethnic minorities, religious minorities, gender-based minorities, and others. And this is where I think advertising as a positive is something we should be looking more at. It's why we do it. We will often get charged with, oh my God, you're suppressing free speech. Well, we're not. If you look for terrorist material, you look for Breivik material, we're not, you look for ISIS material, whatever, we're not out there knocking things down as an organization. We're actually providing people with more choice. We're providing people with the option of extra material, not less material. So by providing them with psychosocial support, by providing them with alternatives in terms of the ideas that are being put out there, that is an additive, not something that takes away. So I actually think in some ways there's an intersection between the human rights concerns and the free speech concerns that are rightly raised throughout the world, and especially in America, and advertising, because so much counter-extremism work is about taking things away, and I think advertising gives us an opportunity to add things to the discourse, to safeguard people without removing free speech and without targeting communities. And there's another second point to this, and I'll stop after this when it comes to targeting, is the kinds of micro-targeting that is currently possible through some of these platforms is at times creepy. You know, there's no doubt about it, but it's also highly accurate. There are many. I've seen many counter-extremism campaigns, or campaigns that allude to be counter-extremism campaigns, where their target groups are just young Muslim men. And they run these paid campaigns on Facebook or on Twitter or on Google elsewhere with straight up counter-extremism messaging, just targeting young Muslim men. I've seen the same thing in the American South. I've seen people kind of saying, well, we just need to focus on, you know, young men in young white men in the American South because they're all potential Nazis. This is also a huge issue with this. And targeted advertising helps us to overcome some of those human rights issues, because instead of targeting people because of their faith, because of their gender, because of where they are, you can target people based on behaviors. You can target people based on the fact that they're regularly engaging with extremist content, or content that is right on that edge in terms of great replacement theory or other ones, and not to do with their gender, ethnic, or religious background. So there is actually a really strong connection here between the kinds of advertising technology that's available to us as counter-extremism activists and issues about free speech and stigmatization. And I think too often they get talked about as if they're separate issues, and we all day, every day, see them as intimately connected. So anyway, I don't know if I answered your question, Courtney, but.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's really excellent. I do want to invite, I think there's like an iPad questions situation. So
Courtney, whilst you're doing that, could I build
sorry,
on one?
I just want to,
Sure.
I will get to you in a moment, John, just a moment, because I do want to just stick to two things that Ross said. One, this idea of being additive rather than detractive, I think is something we need to look at more, right? This does, I think, raise fewer human rights concerns. And similarly, you know, you're talking about these are the people we want to reach. If you're a journalist or a researcher, if you get that kind of ad, it's probably less detrimental than if you weren't able to access that content in the first place. So as a journalist and researcher, I kind of like that approach better. And you also alluded to the importance of targeted advertising. And I think this raises an issue that is not for this panel, but must be addressed, which is the platform design and policies and the lack of national privacy laws, again, particularly in the US, that prevent this aggregation and collection of certain types of data that allow you to target people who are already likely to become extremists or lookalike audiences, et cetera. So I don't want to get into that here because we do discuss platform design a lot in other venues. I want to leave time for questions. And while the question's coming in, John, please go ahead.
Thank you. Sorry for interrupting
you, John.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about the takedown culture that you mentioned, which became really dangerous shortly after 2017, when everybody overreacted. If you can imagine, the brand safety pendulum went from kind of dangerous to super safe. Don't get me anywhere near anything that could possibly be controversial. And what suffered hugely was news, because of course news is often controversial. Not bad necessarily, but we started blocking things like basketball coverage because it had the word shot in it, and anything. We just used technology to take stuff down This was before really good syntax analysis was available, and so news really suffered, and that was really bad news. I mean, sometimes some smaller local newspapers lost 60 or 70% of their revenue. 60 or 70% of your revenue just went down because of the takedown culture, because people weren't thinking about what should I be doing, and they were using exclusion lists, like a hammer rather than like a scalpel, which they should have been doing. And fortunately, we've been able to come back and address that. But I worry about the whole, let's take this down, let's take it down sooner, let's take that down. If there's a risk, let's take this down. We can't do that because the minority, particularly minority publications, the LGBTQ minority black-owned publications suffered the most as a result of that, because, oh my God, the word gay, stay away from that. Black violence, stay away from that. And so, exclusion words started adding up into the thousands, and that's not something we want to perpetuate.
Thank you for raising that, John. As you know, I mean, we've discussed this for the past several years, because not only kind of minority news organizations, but think about the global South. If you're covering Boko Haram, in the parts of Africa where that is active, or if you're covering separatist groups in parts of Southeast Asia, like that could really easily trigger those sort of filters. Even now, we've gotten, I think, more sophisticated than keyword filters, but at the same time, there is a very valid reason to want to maintain the sustainability of independent local news outlets. And I think to this point, Ross's point about additive approaches, there's in using advertise to incentivize kind of good behavior. There is the Ads for News initiative, which is looking at how do we kind of get ads to focus on supporting real news versus, say, other types of information. But I want to ask the audience if there are any questions, and ask Ross if you can facilitate that, since there is something to do with an iPad.
Yeah, I have an iPad here. We have a couple of questions from the audience. So one of them is, so much work across this and adjacent fields would benefit from coming up with a shared language or definition for discussing these problems. Can you speak more about the process of standardizing these definitions?
Okay, and then can you also read the second question so we can?
Do you mind if I just add on to what we were just talking about keywords? Because when I'm not on other people's boards, I actually have a company, and the company that we built is 1,000+ minority-owned media. We built an ad server, and we serve the ads to about 1.2 billion ads a month in minority-owned media. Although we have got, I agree, we've got more sophisticated from keywords. Still the most blocked, so the top 5 blocked keywords, both in the UK and the US, starts with Muslim, then it's lesbian, then this is above murder and gun and stuff, and then it's got gay, it's got black man is in the top 10. And this is still today, I work with, I think he's probably on your team in the UK, Stefan, and to tackle this, because brands are still giving these keywords. We do have technology that can do contextual targeting, so don't block the word, look at it, is it positive, negative, neutral, and then block it around that. But that's still not really widely being adopted. And, it's also, we alluded to it earlier, it's who built that AI that says that is a positive, negative, or neutral article, if they are not from, and I think, I got here on Sunday, so I've been going to a lot of sessions while I've been here. And one overriding thing that I really wanted to get across while on this stage talking about advertising is a lot of the communities where a lot of hate and radicalization is coming from tends to be in a deprived area for various reasons. I don't just mean about money, but maybe it's education and all of these things. And advertising can really help to pump money into them communities. I'm going to speak really plainly because I'm from Manchester and that's how we talk. You know, black people own black publications and have black babies and feed them black babies with the money they make from advertising spending in their black media. You know, that money then goes into the community, you know, LGBTQ plus, disability, religion. We've talked a lot about targeting, but not so much on this side of the pond because it's a bit more Wild West. But in the UK, you know, we can't target for protected characteristics. It's against GDPR. So you can't target someone because they're Muslim. That's against GDPR. You can't target because they're black. So, you know, we've sort of got to think about how are we going to fund and take that 2.6 billion that's been going to hate speech and bad content and put that across to this community-led or, you know, publication. Because if you pumped 2.6 billion, if you just switch that over tomorrow, a lot of these other problems in these other rooms and, you know, that I've heard great people talking about will slowly go away because there'll be more money in the economy for that community. Then they'll be able to, you know, afford to send their kids to different colleges and schools. And, you know, I think advertising can play a massive play. And then secondly, I think, sorry, I know I'm going on. You know, we all see advertising every day 1,000 times a day. We see it whether it's a TV ad, we see it when we're reading publications, you know, it's even on a digital PDF white paper, there's advertising on the front of it before you go into it, or the website that you downloaded it from, you know, so whether you're academia, etc. And I think we have a great power. I love being in advertising because, you know, we get to be emotive, we get to make people think and change, and we get to make people understand other communities. And a lot of this, you know, hate comes from a misunderstanding of a community. You know, of course it's deeper and there's a lot more educated people, but I just think we should really, across the whole industry, take great pride and also sort of grab that opportunity to really change things and to use that great power for good.
Thank you for pointing out like a really holistic view of this. I think that is incredibly valuable, and I really hope that's heard. You know, as this idea of advertising intervention actually has a lot of greater knock-on effects, which you really highlighted. So thank you for that. I want to hone in on this one issue, kind of machine learning classifiers, right? That's essentially how these algorithms learn, and they are, you know, much better in English, though far from perfect. And thanks for pointing out, Christopher, also that these blacklist words still continue, and I would love to get a copy of that research. But you know, in other languages other than English, things are even worse. So let's hear a response to the question from Ross and John in particular with respect to standard setting, and also if you can address the issue of language and how we do that kind of across different contexts, and maybe if you have any specific examples of collaborative efforts underway. John, do you want to go first?
I mean, we kind of talked a little bit about standards and the work that's being done to create standards across the group. Remember, something like the organization like GARM, I think has got knocking on 300 members now, and so that's pretty inclusive, and that you know, that includes all of the advertising groups and some academic groups as well, in terms of creating standards. For not just defining what inappropriate content looks like, but what measurement looks like, and how to tackle each of these.
But let me ask you, because yes, GARM is doing that within this entity, but you've got the OECD that's creating minimum reporting standards and transparency standards. You've got the SASB, the standard setting board, and the International Standard Setting Board creating definitions and standards. So how are you thinking across, like outside of your industry, across the wider issue, of addressing online harms? And also, how do you work with legislators like in the UK or the EU or elsewhere that are creating regulatory frameworks? Not so much what are you doing in GARM, but what are you doing beyond GARM to harmonize those standards?
I mean, I have to admit that we've been focusing on the industry and the advertising industry and keeping brands away from harm and creating a sort of a better internet that way, using the platforms. And we found when we talk to many other bodies, they haven't done the work that we've done yet. And I think it's not beating the advertising business's chest. It's simply that's where the money is, and that's why the focus has been there. We really should work outside of the advertising business in other organizations. Our work inside GARM and inside the industry isn't finished yet, and I guess that's why we're focused there. But is there an opportunity wider than that? Absolutely, and let's use the momentum that's been created now by these 300 organizations. So we would welcome speaking, more widely. And if any of those are represented in the group, please chat to me, and I'll introduce you to the team at GARM. And we would liberally share what we've done and discuss any standards outside of the industry, not industry standards.
Great. Thank you for that, John. I mean, that is the reason that I wanted to, bring this discussion to the Eradicate Hate Summit. And I think, really appreciate the organizers putting together this panel, because this is the, I think, beginning of a conversation to get outside of these industry standards. And there's a lot to be learned, again, from like the GIFT-CT process and the Christchurch call, what's being done. When you have the people with the money involved, you can get things done faster. So, Ross, do you want to respond to this question, or do you want to read the next one?
I'm conscious that we're now kind of over time as well. So the other two questions are actually directed at me, and I can talk to whoever about specific things about redirect. So I can just talk to you guys afterwards. And then in terms of the standards, just a very quick one to notice when we're talking about legality and legal standards, it is worth mentioning that if we're talking about prescribed terrorist organization, those prescription lists are deeply biased, and it's relatively easy to have a Salafi jihadist group or a ethno-nationalist group on there, but there's a complete dearth of white supremacist and REMV groups on those lists. There are reasons for that in terms of the UN and the EU processes that they have to follow. So I would also say, while standard sharing is important, we can't wait for these lists to be complete. Those of us that have shared understanding need to just get on with the work.
Could I add about the language as well? I know you were talking about language earlier. I think that's, if it's like my last 2 minutes on here, that language is really important. Whether you're saying things like blacklist means the bad list, whitelist means the good list, that subconsciously just batters you with black's bad, white's good, black's bad, white's good. You don't pay your rent or your mortgage and your house gets blacklisted. I think language, even, I'd even go as far as to say, do we not want to rehabilitate hate rather than eradicate it? Because that's quite, we're going to eradicate you and zap you with a zapper and you're going to be gone, So, and then I think just lastly, because, I've had the great pleasure of being here, I would say to look after yourselves, everybody here and in this, because talking about this and, sometimes you've sat on stage as a black guy and have to talk about a bit of trauma and why is that important when we're talking about race, our races, our religions, our sexual orientations. It's heavy. And then you've got to go back and you've got to tell your company, and then they might ask you to do it again because you've got a little bit of knowledge in that, and it's just a heavy thing. So, one of the reasons why I've moved to the UK and I stepped down as CEO in Europe was because it just got a lot and I needed to see a psychiatrist, and, because you're talking about bad all the time. Yes, we're trying to fix it, all of us, but you're just constantly talking about what's bad and educating yourself on bad stuff and giving, talking about personal traumas. So yeah, just to everybody to just this is heavy stuff. So just look after yourselves.
Thank you for raising that, Christopher. I think that's a really important point. And just to also add to something that Ross said, a lot of this is taking place in a framework of US, UK, global North, Europe. So much of this is focused, because the companies are based there, the advertisers are based there, the power dynamics are based there. My work, I focus a lot on specifically thinking about how technology policies and these broader policies set in global North institutions impact global South people, and they are, people and family members. And so I think, we want to also be cognizant of that when we think about definitions and when we think about standardization, we think about where resources are being devoted, because this is also very global north heavy. It's not thinking about the forms of terrorism and extremism and addressing those, that are being experienced in vast swaths of the world, including by state sponsors of terrorism. We are definitely at time. I want to thank our panel, really rich and interesting discussion. I hope that maybe on the Twitter account, you guys can share some of the reports that you mentioned. The GAR measurement report is really useful. The websites for all of these organizations have a wealth of information, and this is the beginning of a conversation and an effort to think more about how we can align all of this. And I think Christopher highlighted it for us all. This isn't just a theoretical idea. This has real lived implications on the people who are affected in so many ways. So thank you to our panelists. Thank you to the audience, and farewell.
Thanks, Courtney.